Chapter 1. The Revolution and the Collapse of the Army. On the verge. Towards the winter of 1916, the bloody struggles which we had waged throughout the summer and autumn drew to a close. We consolidated our position, filled in the gaps in our effective forces, and reorganized generally. The experience gained from 2 years of warfare had not been acquired in vain. We had learnt a great deal, and the shortcomings for which we had paid so dearly were now discounted. A number of generals who had not kept the pace with the modern needs had give up their commands, and life had brought other more capable men to the fore. But nepotism, which permeated all spheres of Russian life, still brought unworthy men into important positions too often. Convention, routine, and fear of disregarding the customs of promotion by seniority still held sway, especially amongst the higher military staff. After 2 years of warfare, the army was not what it had been. The majority of the original officers and men, especially in the infantry, had been killed or put out of action. The new officers, hastily trained and lacking in military education and esprit de corps, could not make satisfactory instructors for the men. They knew how to die bravely for the honor of their country and their flag, like all the staff officers, but they felt that they had been uprooted from their normal and anything but military work and had neither the mentality nor the spirit of the true soldier. They found difficulty in enduring the dangers, fatigues, and privations of life at the front, and war to them meant nothing but suffering. It was impossible for them to inspire troops and put fresh into their heart into their men. Neither were the troops what they had been. The original soldiers, inured to fatigue and privation and brave in battle, were better than ever, but there were few of them left, and the new contingents were by no means satisfactory. The reserve forces were primarily fathers of families who had been dragged away from the villages, and were warriors only in spite of themselves. For they had forgotten that once upon a time they had been soldiers. They hated war, and thought only of returning to their homes as soon as possible. Before they were sent to the front, these men were passed through the cadres and given some preliminary training, but it was very inadequate. There were not enough cadres, and the barracks allotted to them were too small to house all the men. Furthermore, the instructors, both commissioned and non-commissioned officers, were not up to the work. They were either disabled and worn out from active service, or else very young officers who themselves had much to learn. The infantry, whose losses were heaviest of any, suffered most from this arrangement. But nevertheless, in spite of everything, the army was still strong and impressive. The morale of the troops was excellent, and the discipline perfect. I never once saw or even heard of the slightest expression of disaffection or disorder. Indeed, before this could happen, the very idea of authority had to disappear, and the generals themselves had to set the example of breaking the bonds of loyalty which existed between officers and men. It is obvious that after 2 years of warfare, the moral standards of the army could not have but slackened, and respect for the law diminished. Requisitioning, an inevitable consequence of any war, had lessened the soldiers' disregard for the other people's property. Base instincts were aroused, but I repeat that they would not have been set in motion before an external shock. A great deal of work was being done, especially in the wake of the army behind the lines, by a numerous class of people which was on the increase during these last months. The individuals of this class had been mobilized and were in perfect health, but they had an unconquerable aversion from the endless whining of bullets and the bursting of shells, and so, secure in the protection and support of the quieter atmosphere, they sat on all kinds of committees and occupied themselves in the organization of reading rooms and the canteens for the trenches. These men, dressed in absurd uniforms, all spurred and laced, took great pains with the main body of the army, especially the ensigns, for the staff and soldiers of the technical units were recruited from amongst the intelligentsia. Most of the army, rank and file as well as officers, took no part at all in politics. They had other things to do, and besides, they lacked newspapers and information. One party amongst officers echoed the gossip of the neighboring general staff. They believed that the general headquarters were au courant with current events in the country, and prophesied that the disorder in the interior would finally react on the army and so lead to its defeat. We continually told one another that things would not come to pass in this Petersburg. Those of us who loved our country and the army were terribly anxious at continual changes in the ministry, the conflicts between the government and the Duma, and the ever-increasing number of petitions and appeals addressed to the Tsar by many influential organizations, each one demanding popular control, and above all, by the alarming rumors concerning certain persons in the Tsar's entourage. The patriots amongst the high command suffered deeply as they watched the Tsar making fatal mistakes, whilst the danger grew and came ever nearer. They held mistaken views, but they believed in them sincerely. They contemplated the possibility of revolution from within the palace to be effected by means of a bloodless coup d'etat. General Krymov, my immediate superior, was one of those who strongly in favor of this plan. He was commander of a division of the Surian Cossacks, in which I commanded a regiment of Nerchinsk Cossacks. During the long discussions we had on many an evening, he tried again and again to prove to me that things could not go on as they were, that we must prevent a catastrophe, and that we ought to find men who, without a day's delay, would remove the Tsar by means of a revolution from within the palace. There were other commanders who also agreed that things could not go on as they were, but they realized how inopportune a change in the time of war would be, and saw that would inevitably entail a collapse of the army and ruin of the country. Others again desired for a revolution for purely personal reasons, hoping to find in it scope for their ambitions, or profit from it and settle their accounts with such of the commanders as they hated. I am firmly convinced that if, from the beginning of the revolutionary movement, headquarters and the generals at the front had forgotten their personal interests and acted unanimously and resolutely, the army would not have collapsed, nor the interior fallen prey to anarchy, or at least that things would have been checked in time. The Tsarevich's regiment of the Nerchinsk Cossacks, which I commanded during the winter of 1916, was a part of the division of the Surian Cossacks. This division, recruited from eastern Siberia, enjoyed a high reputation in the army. It had covered itself in glory many times, and recently my regiment had signally rewarded for its distinguished conduct in Gallica. His Majesty had appointed his son honorary commander of the regiment, which henceforth became known as the Tsarevich's Own. During the Civil War, the majority of officers of the Isaurian division and the Nerchinsk regiment in particular were in Admiral Kolchak's army, and met again under the command of Ataman Semenov and General Ungern. At the time of which I am speaking, these two generals, who have since played a prominent part in the Civil War, were captains of the 5th and 6th Squadron of the Nerchinsk regiment. Semenov was a Transbalkan Cossack, dark and thick-set, and of the rather alert Mongolian type. His intelligence was of a specifically Cossack caliber, and he was an exemplary soldier, especially courageous when under the eye of his superior. He knew how to make himself popular with the Cossacks and officers alike, but he had his weakness, a love of intrigue and indifference to the means by which he achieved his ends. Though capable and ingenious, he had received no education, and his outlook was narrow. I have never been able to understand how he came to play a leading role. Captain Baron Ungern Stenberg, or simply the Baron, as his troops called him, was complex and interesting. He was of the type that was invaluable in wartime and impossible in times of peace. At the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War, though still almost a child, he had left school and joined up as a volunteer in an infantry regiment. He was wounded many times as he was decorated. After the war, he went back to Russia, where his relatives made him enter military school. He passed his officer's examination only with great difficulty. Longing for adventure and feeling out of his element in the regular army, he set out for Siberia and joined a Cossack regiment. He did not remain with it long. One night, in a fit of drunken anger, he picked a petty quarrel with one of his comrades and struck him. The man dealt him a sword blow on his head, and he felt the effects of the wound for the rest of his life. It undoubtedly upset his mental balance. He returned to Russia and decided to travel from Vladivostok to Karbin on horseback. He left his regiment, swung himself into a saddle, whistled to his dog, and set off with a fowling piece slung over his shoulder, hunting for his food and sleeping in the open air. He took a whole year to reach Karbin. There he learned that the war had just broken out between the Chinese and the Mongols. He remounted his horse, pushed on to Mongolia, and offered his services, and there he was, commander of the whole cavalry force of Mongolia. At the outbreak of the World War, he came back to Russia and joined up as a sub-lieutenant in the Nerchinsk army. From the first, he won distinction by his courageous exploits. He was wounded many times and decorated with the St. George's Cross, the highest honor a soldier can win, and by the end of the year he was a captain in command of a squadron. He was of medium height, fair and puny looking, with a long reddish mustache, but he possessed an iron constitution and a ruthless energy. War was his natural element. He was not an officer in the ordinary sense. He knew nothing of system, turned up his nose at discipline, and was ignorant of the rudiments of decency and decorum. He was not an officer, but a hero out of one of Mein Reed's novels. He was dirty and dressed untidily, slept on the floor with his Cossacks, and messed with them. When he was promoted to a civilized environment, he lacked all outward refinement, made him conspicuous. I tried in vain to awaken his conscience to a need of adopting at least the external appearance of an officer. He was a man of queer contrasts. He had an original, penetrating mind, but at the same time an astonishing lack of culture, an extremely narrow outlook, the shyness of the savage, a foolish swagger, and an unbridled temper. He was very extravagant, though his means were exceptionally small. In accordance with the old customs, we had to offer the new honorary commander a horse and uniform of the regiment which was to bear his name. Consequently, I left for the capital at the head of the deputation from the regiment, taking with me a small Majorian horse just big enough for the young Tsarevich. Scarcely 2 months before this, I had been in Petersburg recovering from a wound I had got at the famous charge which had earned us the signal honor which was the cause of my returning to Petersburg today. Confusion was rife in all circles. There seemed to be a presentiment aboard the nearness of the terrible events which destiny was preparing for Russia. In the Duma and the Imperial Council, and in different political groups, a pretense of stern authority was reduced to a matter of public speaking matches and political debates, while in artisan circles and in urban associations there was a subterranean propaganda at work, fed no doubt by the Germans. Yet, at the same time, the majority of the population remained absorbed in its little daily cares. The queues lined up outside the shops, the theaters and the cinemas were full, and the same old trivial conversations were to be overheard in the crowd. Court circles appearing to pay no heed to the approaching storm. High society and the upper bureaucracy remained absorbed in their usual weighty questions, such as the appointment of someone to some post, or the opinions held by the Grand Duke or the Empress's party. Social life followed its usual course, and it seemed as if the people were merely to be spectators, and not the victims of the drama to come. Some day after my arrival, I entered the service of the Tsar as aide-de-camp, and had many opportunities of meeting the Tsar and chatting with him. He produced an impression of an extraordinary simplicity and unusual kindliness on everyone who met him. The result of his outstanding traits of his character, his perfect education, and his complete self-mastery, he had an alert mind, was skilled in the art of innuendo, and possessed an amazing memory. He remembered not only events, but names, dates. One day he spoke to me of battle which my regiment had taken part, although it was a long time ago and we had done nothing noteworthy. He had even mentioned the villages in which the regiment of our division had quartered. I began my service as aide-de-camp to the Tsar one Saturday, relieving Duke Nicholas of Luxembourg. That day, dinner was served in my Empress's apartments. There were only the imperial family and myself sat at the table. Their Majesties kept me part of the evening for a chat. The Tsar was merry and vivacious. The Grand Duchess and the Tsarevich laughed together and exchanged badinage. But I was struck by the expression of the suffering on the Empress's face. She had grown much thinner in the 2 months since I had last seen her, and I particularly noticed the expression in her eyes. It was sad, I might say absent-minded, that she was especially interested in the organization of medical relief in the army, and also asked me detailed questions on the new type of gas mask. The next Sunday, I accompanied the Majesties to church. The little temple, built in old Russian style, was packed. Watching the imperial couple at prayer, I involuntarily compared the Tsar's expression of pious contemplation with the Empress's look of sorrowful ecstasy. Some days later, I presented the deputation from my regiment to His Majesty. I little dreamt that this was the time I was last to see the Tsar. 2. On the Romanian front. That same evening, I received a telegram from General Krymov. Our division was to leave for Romania, so I was to rejoin my regiment immediately, taking back with me all officers and men on leave from Petersburg. We left the next day. As far as the Romanian frontier, the trains were running much as usual, but across the frontier things were very different. The Romanian troops were retreating, and the line was blocked by trains full of refugees, wounded, and munitions. And I saw for the first time that what I saw daily after this, passengers sitting on the roof of the carriage, on the buffers, and even on the engines. At a branch line, not too far from the terminus, our 2 carriages were hooked onto an express, so that we might have a chance of keeping warm. I had with great difficulty extracted a promise that we should be put on the front of the train. I do not know how it happened, but they hooked us on at the back after all. This saved our lives. Dashing along at full speed, our train crashed into the train in front of us, and the first 14 carriages were wrecked. There were several hundred killed and injured. We found our division on the march, making for the line of the Sereth, from where we were to make for Galatz, where the great masses of cavalry were to be concentrated. Then came a counter-order, and we retraced our steps through the driving rain, soaked to the skin. During the march, an orderly came to inform me that General Krymov, who was marching at the head of our column, wanted me. I found him with our general staff near a wood house, busily reading a letter which had just come. Whilst I was some way off, he called out to me, "Great news at last! They killed Rasputin." The newspapers announced the bare facts. Letters from the capital gave the details. Of the three assassins, I knew two intimately: Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich and Prince Yusupov. What had been their motive? Why, having killed a man whom they regarded as a menace to the country, had they not admitted their action before everyone? Why had they not relied on justice and public opinion instead of trying to hide all trace of the murder by burying the body under the ice? We thought over the news with great anxiety. In the first days of 1917, I was made commander of the brigade which my old Nurchenk regiment was a part. I was genuinely sorry to part from my gallant comrades in arms, for whom I had shared victory, fatigue, and danger for 14 months. As my brigade was stationed behind the lines for the time being, I took the opportunity to spend a few days in Jassy. I stayed with Masalov, our minister resident there, and an old fellow officer of mine. The town was full of refugees and behind-the-line organizations. It was almost impossible to find lodgings. They were expecting the Grand Duchess Cyril, the Queen of Romania's sister. Never having belonged to the Grand Duchess's intimate circle, I refrained from calling on her to pay her my respects. But on the very day of my arrival, the court-martial, Im Hartung, called me to inform that the Grand Duchess expected me the next day at 10 o'clock at the Queen's Palace. They had not been able to find a building in Jassy room enough to house the entire royal family of Romania, so the Queen and her children were living in one house, the King in another. At the Grand Duchess's, I met the commander of the town, General Kaskovich, former aide-de-camp to the Tsar, and the Grand Duchess kept us for more than an hour. She gave me details of all the latest events in Petersburg, of the arrest and banishment to Persia of the Grand Duke Dmitri Pavlovich, of the joint letter which all the members of the imperial family had sent to the Tsar begging for the mercy of the Grand Duke, of the Tsar's refusal, and of the disgrace of the Grand Duke Nicholas Mikhailovich, because he had sent a violent letter to the Tsar in which he had been given expression to a certain bitter truths. According to the Grand Duchess, all members of the imperial family, even the Tsar's closest relations, realized very clearly the danger that was threatening the dynasty in the whole of Russia. The Tsarina alone could not or would not see it. Her sister, Grand Duchess Elizabeth, the Grand Duchess Cyril herself, and Princess Yusupov, the mother of Rasputin's murderer, had all tried in vain to open her eyes. I know Russia better than you do, and I have known it much longer. Besides, there is a Russia whose existence you do not even realize. You only hear what is said in Petersburg in corrupt aristocratic circles. They are not speaking for the people. If you had been with the Tsar and myself at the front, you would know that how the people and army adore him. The Tsarina opened a drawer, taken out a bundle of letters, and shown them to the Grand Duchess. All these letters are from officers and soldiers, simple Russian men. I receive a similar pile every day. They all adore the Emperor and beg him not to yield an inch to the intrigues of the Duma. The Grand Duchess gave us an understanding that the majority of the members of the imperial family, especially the family of the Grand Duchess, Maria Pavlovna, mother of the Grand Duke Cyril, considered it necessary to modify the existing order of things, and that many influential members of the Duma shared this view. This long interview with the Grand Duchess Cyril left a painful impression on my mind. I had met her many times in Petersburg, but I had never been one of her circle. Her desire to see me, and the confidence with which she honored me, seemed to me a trifle unusual. Subsequent events, and the part that the Grand Duke Cyril played at the head of the revolutionary Marines of the Guard in the first days of the Revolution, perhaps explains many things. Footnote. During the February Revolution, rather than put down a revolt, Grand Duke Cyril led his men, who had been assigned to protect the Tsarina, to the Tauride Palace and swore allegiance to the provisional government. The following day, I was invited to dine with the Queen of Romania, who placed me beside her at the table, and was as charming as she is beautiful. Fortunately, no one reopened the subject of events in Petersburg. On my return to the embassy, I found a telegram informing me that I had been promoted to the rank of general. As our divisional general was ill, I was to deputize for him. The same evening, I left to rejoin the army. At the end of January, received our orders to present ourselves at Kishinev. Bessarabia is a very fertile country. Provisions and provender were plentiful, and at last our troops could obtain all they needed. We marched by long stages. The winter was very severe, and we had heavy snowfalls. This made the marches doubly laborious, but our Transbalakian horses were used to such conditions, and we arrived speedily without excessive discomfort. The pretty little town of Kishinev was usually so quiet and sleepy, was unrecognizable. It was humming with life. Our division, Count Keller's Cavalry Corps, the Prince Bagration's division, was quartered in the town itself, or in the nearest suburbs. The theaters and restaurants were too full of officers and Cossack and cavalry regiments. The nobility, the municipality, and the merchants vied with one another in making us welcome. Dinners, balls, and tea dances followed one another in rapid succession. The officers, who had been deprived of all these things for the last 2 years, gave themselves up gaiety wholeheartedly. The hardship of winter were forgotten, and we were far from foreseeing the horrors of the morrow. At the front and in the interior during the Revolution. Our divisional headquarters were 18 versts from Kishinev, but we had a modest pied-à-terre in the town itself. When Krymov returned and had settled down there, I went back to headquarters. At the beginning of March, rumors of trouble in Petersburg were going around the town. There were talk of strikes, disturbances, and risings. But as all the rumors were extremely vague, we paid very little attention to them. On March 4th or 5th, about 8 o'clock in the evening, I was having supper quietly at home when General Krymov telephoned me. I gathered from the tone of his voice that something serious had happened. He said, "The revolution has broken out in Petersburg. The Tsar has abdicated. I am going to read you his manifesto, and that of his successor, the Grand Duke Michael. Tomorrow the troops must be told." I begged the general to wait a moment, and fetched the chief of our general staff. As Krymov spoke, he wrote down the text. The general finished reading the Tsar's manifesto, and began on the Grand Duke Michael's. At the first words, I said to the chief of the general staff, "This is the end of everything. This is anarchy." Certainly, the very fact of the Tsar's abdication, even though it was provoked by social discontent, would absolutely stagger the people and the army. But this was not all. The danger lay in the destruction of the monarchical idea and the disappearance of the monarch. During the last few years, many loyal hearts had become alienated from the Tsar. The army, as well as the country, realized that he had endangered his throne by his own actions. If he had abdicated in favor of his son or his brother, such an act would not have aroused much painful feeling in the country. The Russian people would have sworn their allegiance to the new Tsar and continued to serve him and their country to the death, as they had always done, for the faith, the Tsar, and the homeland. But in present circumstances, with the disappearance of the Tsar, the very idea of authority and the age-old obligations vanished, and nothing could take the place of either in the minds of the Russian people. What the officers and the Russian soldiers must have felt, brought up on the monarchical principle and loyal in their allegiance to the Tsar, they had acted on the principles all their lives and saw the chief meaning of the war in them. I must admit that the high command remained absolutely passive, doing nothing to help the army through the crisis. To keep up the spirits of the troops or to make them realize their duty, they issued no orders, and each general had to do what he thought was for the best. One or two stupid things were done. One colonel of the infantry regiment could find nothing more intelligent to say to his men than that the Tsar had gone mad. I decided to communicate the two manifestos to the soldiers and explain things as I saw them myself. I informed them of the disturbances in the interior and of the general discontent, a natural result of the abuses committed by officials who had duped the Tsar, or one who had too incompetent to do their duty and to cope with the difficulties of war. I told them that I did not know why the Tsar had considered it necessary to abdicate, but here were the manifestos of the Tsar and the Grand Duke. The will of the Tsar, to whom we had sworn allegiance, and that of his successor ought to be sacred to us, and since he commanded us to obey and be loyal to the provisional government, our duty was to do so. In the morning, the two manifestos were read to the regiments. The first impression can be described in one word: stupefaction. It was a staggering blow. Officers and men were dumbfounded and could scarcely pull themselves together. For some days the camp was gloomy, everyone trying to understand what had happened. Only in the units where intellectuals were leaders, and especially behind the lines, ambulances, depots, etc., cheerfulness reigned supreme, and the new regime was celebrated joyfully. The crisis safely over, I went to see General Krymov. He took an optimistic view of things, believing that we were on the eve of a renaissance and not of disaster. The town was already given over to the popular political meetings. Groups of people were marching about under the red flag. At the crossroads, orators sprung from goodness knows where were haranguing people, but the general continued to be optimistic. He was convinced that the army would keep out of politics altogether, and said that since a change of government was inevitable, it was better that it should happen now, and not after the demobilization. Then the army could return, weapons in hand, to dictate the law of the land in its own way. He told me the names of the members of the provisional government. Guchkatov, the Minister of War, was the only one who had any idea of the needs of the army. He had been at the head of the Red Cross during the Russo-Japanese War and the president of the Committee of National Defense in Duma. Now he was the chairman of the Technical Revictulating Committee. Krymov, who knew him intimately, had full confidence on him. Nevertheless, the appointment of a civilian to a post of Minister of War in the middle of a campaign was a risky proceeding. Yes, Krymov said to me. He is a real statesman, and furthermore, he knows much about the army as you and I do. You will see how things go. He is not to be compared with those damned old regime mongers who spent their whole lives in the ministries. He is worth the whole lot of them put together. The head of the government, Prince Lavov, had been the president of the United Zemstvos, footnote, a local representative assembles. He was reputed to be of a staunch patriot and an honest man. Milyukov and Chingorev had been eloquent leaders of the opposition, but of the rest, Terechnikov, Nekrasov, and others, we knew little or nothing, and we were justified in doubting whether the necessary men capable of taking power into their hands were to be found amongst them. The general gave me the newspapers, which he had just arrived from Petersburg. They were scarcely reassuring. It was clear that the government was already drifting from its original course, taken in tow by the Soviets of the deputies and workmen and soldiers. I was especially angry to hear, for the first time, that soldiers and officers would end by understanding one another, and that officers would be forced to respect the soldiers who were men like themselves. This humbug was not only repeated by nobodies, but by such men as M. Milyukov at his speech in the Tauride Palace on March 2nd. My fears were only too well founded. The provisional government's first measures showed that the disorder in the interior had gone too far to be suppressed, and that these incompetent men, strangers to the army, could do nothing to prevent things from going to ruin. One morning, Krymov telephoned me saying, "Get together whatever you need for a few days' absence. You must leave for Petersburg. Come over here and I will tell you what it is all about." An hour later, I was in Kishinev. I found the general in his shirt sleeves and lead brooches. Surrounded by crumpled newspapers which were torn to pieces and trampled underfoot, he was beside himself. "Read that," he said, thrusting the newspaper in my hands. "They have lost their heads. God knows what is happening there. I cannot believe that is really Gorchakov. How can he allow those scoundrels to touch the army? I have written to him. I cannot leave my division without the permission of my immediate superior. You can go, because I am your immediate superior, and I give you permission. Go to Petersburg and see Gorchakov." He began to read his letter to me, in words expressive of sorrow and the deepest indignation. He drew attention to the danger that threatened the army, and the whole of Russia with it. The army ought to remain outside of politics altogether, and all those who meddled in it were committing a crime against their country. In the middle of loading the letter, he clasped his hands into his hands and burst into sobs. The letter ended by begging the minister to regard everything that I said as coming from himself. The same evening I left for Petersburg. On the way, at one of the stations, we met an express coming from the north. General Baron Mannerheim, who later commanded the White Army in Finland, was on it. He was the first eyewitness to give me details of the popular risings in the capital, the treason of the troops and the murder of officers, which had been going on since the beginning of the revolution. Baron Mannerheim himself had been forced to hide for 3 days, slipping from one lodging to another. Amongst the victims of the frenzied mob and the soldiery were a number of my friends: old Count Stackelberg, Count Mingden, formerly a colonel of the Horse Guard, Count Klemech, hussar of the guard, and others too. The last two mentioned had been murdered at Luga by their own soldiers, reservists of the guard. Whilst waiting for our connection at Kiev, we visited the town. The statue of Stolypin had been knocked down and several houses sacked. It was here that I first heard people praising Kerensky. His admirers believed that he was the only member of the government with any control over the populace. They said it was he who had put an end to the massacres that had begun on the first days of the revolution. At Bakhmach, Colonel Count Mengden got into the train. He was the brother of Mengden, who had just been assassinated, and the aide-de-camp to the Grand Duke Nicholas, whom the Tsar had appointed as Generalissimo when he himself had abdicated. He told us that he had just left the Grand Duke, who had already been advised that the provisional government desired him to give up his command to General Alexiev. The Grand Duke had decided to comply with their request to avoid complications. Personally, I considered this to be a fatal decision. The Grand Duke was very popular with the army, with the men as well as the officers. The supreme command and the generals at the front would have bowed to his authority. He alone would have been able to save the army from imminent ruin. The provisional government dared not to even enter into direct conflict with him. Treskoy's Salon station was swarming with drunkenly disorderly soldiers decorated with their red ribbons. They were shouting, fooling around, splitting their sides with laughter, and behaving as though they were conquerors. They jostled the train drivers and climbing into the carriage and the restaurant car in which I was having lunch. A shock-headed little whore with a cigarette in his mouth and a red ribbon on his breast installed himself in serious money at the table of a lady dressed in a hospital nurse and began ogling her. The lady repulsed his attempts, and he gave vent to the obscene insults. I took him by the scruff of his neck and carried him to the door, and I kicked him out, sending him rolling down the corridor. I heard men muttering, but no one made even a show of defending him against me. The first thing I noticed in Petersburg was the profusion of red ribbons. Everyone was decorated with it. Not only the soldiers, but students, chauffeurs, cab drivers, middle-class folk, women, children, and many officers. Men of some account, such as old generals and former aides-de-camp to the Tsar, wore it too. I expressed my astonishment to an old comrade of mine, seeing him thus adorned. He tried to laugh it off, saying jokingly, "Why, my dear fellow, don't you know that it's the latest fashion?" I considered this ridiculous adornment absolutely useless. Throughout my stay in the capital, I wore the Tsarevich's badge, distinguishing mark of my old regiment, on my epaulets, and of course I wore no red rag. Not a soul even sought to molest me because of it. The Duma also trembled before the Soviet of the deputies and of the soldiers and the workmen, and had soon let itself be dismissed docilely enough. The faint-heartedness and servile kowtowing to the new power had been apparent from the first, not only amongst the soldiers and minor officials, but the Tsar's entourage, and even within the ranks of the imperial family itself. From the very first hour of danger, the Tsar had abandoned by everyone. During this terrible time which the Tsarina and her children had spent at Tsarskoye Selo, not a member of the imperial family had gone to their aid. The Grand Duke Cyril Vladimirovich had led the Marines of the Guard and Duma in person, hastening to present himself to M. Rodzinenko, president of Duma. Interviews with him and Nicholas Mikhailovich appeared in many newspapers, in which they spoke about the Tsar in a vile way. I read these interviews with the utmost indignation. The struggle for power between Duma and the Soviet of the deputies of the workmen and soldiers still went on. The provisional government, finding that it had no forces with which to fight openly, took more and more to the fatal course of compromise. Gorchakov, the Minister of War, was away. I told his Chancellor's office to advise me when he returned. The next day they let me know that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, Milyukov, had requested to call and see me. He received me very politely. I am in constant communication with Gorchakov. I can forward him the letter which you bring, and send him a verbatim account of all that you say. He and I belong to different parties, but today we should be all unanimous, should we not? I told him that today iron discipline was more indispensable than ever, that we ought to strengthen and not discredit the authority of the leaders, and that the government's orders were intended to undermine the foundations of the army. In short, I said all that I should have in my military capacity. He listened to me very attentively and made some notes. You interest me much, but I will not conceal from you that the information we have received from the representative of the army does not coincide with what you have just told me, he said. That I can well believe, I replied. But would you be good enough to tell me, sir, to what representatives of the army you were referring? To those who have been elected by nobodies but themselves, and today lord it with the Soviet, or to those who stroll about the streets adorned with red ribbons? In Petersburg, now only real soldiers are lying in the hospitals. It is not they, obviously, who have given you your information. I have no doubt that the others I have mentioned hastened to throw in their lot with the revolution as soon as it broke out. Well, since it is not my province, he concluded, I will refrain from expressing an opinion. M. Gorchakov is more competent than I to deal with their questions in any case. I will inform him of our interview, and when he returns he will probably see you himself. I found a telegram from General Krymov awaiting me at home. The Minister of War had summoned him to Petersburg so as to go back to take his place. When I arrived in Kishinev, Krymov had already left for the capital, taking Samarin, his chief of staff, with him, for he had been appointed chief of minister of the war's cabinet. He was replaced by Colonel Polkinov, who later on, after the General Kornikov's rebellion, played such a disastrous part during the days which the provisional government was falling from power. As a chief of divisional staff, he was a good worker and a conscientious officer. We went through bad times. The provisional government continued to lose ground to the Soviets, which it soon began to lay down the law to it. The army realized that this was happening, and instinctively tried to supply a remedy. A number of regiments informed the government, through their commanders, that they would support it in order to ward off anarchy. All the regiments of our division were of the number. Unfortunately, the government did not know how to take advantage of the proffered help, or did not wish to. Gorchakov, who paid a visit to the army at the time, adopted a very haughty tone, saying that the provisional government was quite strong enough to dispense with all external support, that there had been no division of power, and that the Soviets and the government were acting in complete agreement. Each commanding officer did as he pleased, without consulting his colleagues of other forces and divisions. Whilst Count Keller refused to swear allegiance to the provisional government, and made his troops march past to the strains of the old imperial hymns when he took leave of them, General Bronislav had carried at the head of his troops an armchair decorated with red ribbons. On March 17th, I went to a fete with my Cossack regiment was holding. This regiment was brave enough in battle, but rotten at heart. As I approached on horseback, I saw that most of the squadrons had replaced their battalion colors with red flags. Passing down the ranks, I noticed that one of these flags was spotted with black and was made out of a skirt such as the peasant women wore. I asked the colonel the meaning of this unseemly farce. "General, the Cossacks ordered it." I replied that in the army, the Cossacks had to obey orders and not make them. I saluted the regiment in the usual way, then added, "I came here to drink to the glory of your regiment under your glorious old flag for which so many brave men have died. But now I have changed my mind. It would disgust me to drink to the health of gallant soldiers beneath the shadow of a red petticoat." And I turned back. I censured the colonel and the general orders, with the connivance of one of the captains with whom I was also dissatisfied. He tried to stir up the officers and Cossacks against me, pretending that because I myself was not a Cossack by birth, I wanted to disparage all those who were. When I heard of this, I dismissed him from his command, and ordered him and his partner to leave the division the very day and present themselves behind lines, where they were both brought up for trial. Except for this incident, order was maintained throughout the division. General Krymov came back on March 30th. He had been appointed commander of the 3rd Cavalry Corps in place of Mount Keller. Since M. Gochikov had been in the War Office, 143 of their higher commanders had been dismissed from military staff, and had been replaced regardless of the custom of promotion by seniority. This proceeding was a very grave mistake. It is true that a number of higher commanders lacked ability, but the mass changes, the replacing of the old generals by men who were unknown to the troops, especially at such a critical moment, had a disastrous effect on internal order and the fighting power of the army. General Krymov told me of the massacres at Kronstadt, which had put a period to the life of the best officers in the Baltic fleet. The sailors had assassinated them. Krymov had just seen the new members of the provisional government. Several of them were his friends, and he had regained his courage, according to him, that the provisional government was strong enough to make itself master of events, in spite of its appearance of weakness. The members of the government fully realized the necessity for this. They expected to be supported by large sections of society and of the army, but its principal support, according to Krymov, would be the Cossacks. Also, the general had managed to get my Ossorian division transferred to the Army Corps, in place of the gallant 12th Division of Regular Cavalry. I was far from sharing the hopes he entertained concerning the Cossacks. I had spent part of my youth in the district where the Don Cossacks live. I had gone through the Russo-Japanese War in a Cossack regiment, and had since commanded a regiment, a brigade, and a division of Cossacks. I knew them through and through, and I knew that they could easily become the tool of Cossack political cliques. The separatist tendencies among Cossacks were a serious danger at this time, because Cossacks units formed part of many of the regular divisions. I believed that there were other ways of combating disorder, that there were no need to rely on only one section of the army for support, but that we could achieve agreement amongst the command, and weld the army into one unit. But I failed to convince General Krymov. He had a passionate faith in his new idea. The troops understood it, and began to distinguish between Cossack and non-Cossack officers straight away. Several officers who were not Cossacks asked to be transferred to other regiments. I told the general that, even admitting that I was mistaken and he right, and I would that God that it had been so, we must be consistent and avoid anything that might hinder the success of his plans in the smallest degree. That I, not being Cossack by birth, and having always served in the regular army in peacetime, could not possibly be a suitable colleague for him. General Krymov understood me and did not argue the point. As our appointments had not been yet published, I could obtain another division without any difficulty. The general wrote the Minister of War to this effect, and on April 5th I left for Petersburg.